The wind remembers everything. It moves across the same limestone ridges it moved across 3,000 years ago. It picks up the same pale dust from the same cracked desert floor. And it carries nothing with it now, no sound, no warning, no sign. But once, it carried something. There is a moment preserved in the oldest tribal records of the ancient Hebrews, a moment so precise, so singular, that it survived 10 centuries of oral transmission before anyone thought to write it down. A group of men, trained scouts, hardened by years of desert survival. They push past the dry borders of the Southland. They climb the ridge above the valley of Hebron. And then they stop. All of them. At once. The texts do not tell us how long they stood there. They do not tell us what was said first, or whether anyone said anything at all. What they tell us is this: when these men returned to their camp, when they finally gathered the words to describe what they had seen, they said they felt like grasshoppers. That is not a metaphor. That is the account of trained men, experienced, resilient, unsentimental men who saw something that restructured their entire understanding of the world in real time. The Great Flood was supposed to have ended it. The age of the ancient giants, the Watchers, the Nephilim, the colossal sons of a broken covenant, was supposed to have been sealed beneath the weight of a global catastrophe. Washed away. Silenced. Buried under layers of quiet silt at the bottom of a world reborn. But the scouts of Israel did not see a clean, empty world. They saw the sons of Anak. And nothing was ever the same. Consider the weight of the problem. The ancient scribes who preserved these stories were not naive men. They were careful, methodical recorders of a tradition they considered sacred. And yet embedded within their own sacred narrative was a problem they could not cleanly resolve. The flood story ends in Genesis. The world is cleansed. The sons of God who had taken human wives, whose children had grown into men of terrible renown, all of it supposedly swept beneath the water. A divine reset. A hard line drawn across the page of human history. And then, 4 books later, they're there again. In Numbers. In Deuteronomy. In Joshua. The giant clans resurface. Not as legend. Not as vague tribal memory. But as specific people, with specific names, living in specific cities, embedded in the documented historical memory of early Israelite settlement in the ancient Levant. How? This question, this deeply unsettling theological rupture, did not go unnoticed by the ancient world. In the centuries between the events recorded in Deuteronomy and the great manuscript traditions of the Second Temple period, Jewish scholars wrestled with this paradox openly, urgently, and without resolution. And the evidence of that wrestling survived. In 1947, in a series of limestone caves above the western shore of the Dead Sea, Bedouin shepherds discovered something the ancient world had tried to preserve for centuries. Thousands of manuscript fragments. Hundreds of texts. Many of them familiar. Many of them forgotten. Among those fragments were pieces of a document called the Book of Giants. Not the Book of Genesis. Not the canonical scriptures as later tradition defined them. but a text that existed alongside those scriptures in the libraries of the Qumran community. The ascetic sect that guarded those caves treated as sacred, copied and recopied across multiple manuscripts, considered worth burying in sealed jars against the possibility of destruction. The fragments are designated by modern scholars as 4Q531 and 6Q8, among others. Written in Aramaic, damaged almost beyond reading, and what survives within them is striking. The giants, the sons of the Watchers, are dreaming. The fragments describe enormous figures locked in prophetic nightmares. Visions of cosmic upheaval. An impending destruction that closes in from every direction. The ground splitting open beneath them. Fire consuming the horizon. A desperate, claustrophobic awareness that something absolute and final is coming and there is no path around it. These were not stories designed to entertain around a fire. These were the recorded anxieties of a community that could not make the theological problem go away. If the flood had truly cleansed the world, if the giant bloodlines had truly been exterminated in the deluge, then why did the Bible's own subsequent chapters insist on their reappearance in the mountains of Canaan? The scribes of Qumran did not paper over this contradiction. They preserved it. They copied it. They passed it down. Because no single clean answer had survived the centuries of wrestling. What they offered instead, and what the scriptural traditions before them had offered, was a framework for holding the question without being destroyed by it. The ancient theories were several. Some traditions suggested that certain descendants of the pre-flood giant clans had survived in regions beyond the immediate reach of the deluge. Others pointed to the possibility of post-flood genealogical echoes, that whatever biological or cultural disruption had produced the ancient giants had found its way forward through isolated human lineages, surfacing again in specific pockets of the ancient Levant. Others, more cautious, more theologically conservative, proposed something different. Perhaps the clans who called themselves Anakim, who built their stone fortresses in the mountains of southern Canaan, had simply grown in an environment that rewarded extraordinary physical scale. Perhaps the memory of the Nephilim had been layered onto them by terrified observers, retroactively. Because the human mind has always required a category for things it cannot process by ordinary means. The ancient scribes did not vote on an answer. They preserved the question. And across the mountains of Canaan, 3,000 feet above sea level, behind walls of limestone that dwarfed anything the Bronze Age had produced elsewhere in the region, the sons of Anak did not wait for anyone's theological resolution. They had already built their city. Before it was called Hebron, it had a different name: Kiriath-Arba, the city of Arba. The book of Joshua, chapter 14, verse 15, records it plainly. Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. And the city that bore his name, Kiriath-Arba, was not a village, not a waypoint, not a seasonal encampment. It was a fortress, a monument, a statement in stone placed at the center of the southern Canaan highlands that communicated, with absolute architectural certainty, something very specific to every person who approached it from below. We were here first. We are here now. Approach at your own risk. The ancient text of Numbers chapter 13, verse 22 is among the most precise geographical records preserved in early Hebrew tradition. The Israelite scouts, dispatched by Moses into the land to survey what lay ahead, pushed through the Negev, the harsh, sun-bleached badlands of the south, and arrived at Hebron. And there, in the high city, they found 3 men: Ahiman, Shishai, Talmai. The text gives us their names. It identifies them specifically as the descendants of Anak. And it does not dramatize the encounter. No battle, no confrontation, no diplomatic exchange. It simply places these men in the fortress that dominated the southern approach to the entire land. Present, alive, in possession. The parenthetical that follows in the same verse is easy to overlook, but it carries significant historical weight. Numbers 13:22 closes with this observation: Hebron had been built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. Zoan, known to the classical world as Tanis, was one of the great cities of the Nile Delta. A seat of pharaonic power. A center of Egyptian imperial ambition. To anchor the antiquity of Kiriath-Arba against the construction date of one of Egypt's royal capitals was not a casual editorial note. It was the ancient writer's way of making a very specific point. This city is old. Older than almost anything you stand in awe of. It was here before the empires you measure time by. Stand in awe of this instead. The figure of Arba himself sits at the intersection of multiple traditions that converge on the same conclusion. Joshua 14 identifies him as the greatest of the Anakim, a designation that already assumes the Anakim were a recognized class of people defined by a physical scale. The etymology of the name Anak in ancient Hebrew points toward the concept of the long-necked, those whose stature placed them visibly, unavoidably above the ordinary human horizon. Not as a tribal honorific. Not as a metaphorical expression of social dominance. As a descriptor of physical reality. The Anakim were documented, across multiple independent textual traditions, as tall people. Extraordinarily tall. But here is what the ancient record actually shows, and this is the detail that sensationalized modern retellings almost always obscure. The Anakim were not wandering monsters. They were an aristocracy. Ahiman, Shishai, and Talmai are not placed in the wilderness, hunting animals, terrorizing travelers on open roads. They are documented within the context of an established, sophisticated, high-altitude urban center. A walled city. A city so old it predated the construction of the great Egyptian Delta capitals by generations. A city built at an elevation that placed its inhabitants literally and architecturally above every approach from the valley below. This is the detail the narrative almost never lingers on long enough. Consider the engineering of it. Kiriath-Arba is not built in a valley or on a plain where any army could mass and advance on equal footing. It is built on a mountain. Its walls are constructed from massive limestone blocks carved from the same ridge the city rests upon, so integrated into the natural terrain that the architecture and the mountain itself appear as a single continuous mass of pale, blinding stone against the southern Canaan sky. Anyone approaching from the south from the Negev desert below is forced to climb. And as they climb, The walls grow taller. And somewhere above them, against the glare of the high-altitude sun, figures appear on the battlements. Looking down. Always looking down. At everyone. Pause here for a moment. Not to analyze. Not to theorize. Simply to hold the image. A group of men, worn down by years of desert travel, standing at the base of a mountain fortress, shading their eyes against the limestone glare, tilting their heads back to find the top of the walls, and finding, instead, that the inhabitants have already found them. Now here is where the map gets complicated. Because the Anakim were not alone. When you step back from the walls of Kiriath-Arba and look at the entire regional picture, when you read Deuteronomy alongside Numbers alongside Joshua, when you follow the ancient tribal geographies that these texts collectively preserve across the full arc of the Levant, you realize something the modern reader almost always misses. The giant traditions were not local. Not in the sensationalized, everything is a mystery sense. In the older, quieter sense, were different peoples with different languages and different gods all arrive, independently, at the same observation about the same reality. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, contains a passage that deserves far more attention than it typically receives. Moses, recounting the history of the land to the people of Israel before they enter it, describes the prior inhabitants of the territory east of the Dead Sea. The Anakim used to live there, a people strong and numerous, and as tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they too were considered Rephaim, but the Moabites called them Emim. Let that settle for a moment. The Moabites, the ancient nation of the eastern plateau above the Dead Sea, encountered a people of extraordinary physical scale and gave them a name from within their own language and cultural tradition. They called them Emim. The ancient Hebrews encountered people of the same physical category, or a category so similar that the textual traditions treat them as continuous and place them within the broader classification of the Rephaim, a term that appears throughout the ancient Levantine record as a designation for something categorically set apart from ordinary human scale and ordinary human experience. And the Anakim of Canaan, the sons of Arba, resident in the mountains above Hebron, are explicitly categorized within this same Rephaim tradition. 3 different names. 3 different nations. 3 different cultural vocabularies. All arriving, independently, at the same classification. This is not myth-making by a single scared culture trying to explain a defeat. This is not one tradition projecting its fears onto a vague enemy. This is what it looks like when different peoples with no coordinating agenda, no shared scripture, no reason to agree, all point at the same thing. That kind of convergence is not easy to dismiss. What Deuteronomy chapter 2 quietly draws is a map. The populations remembered as Rephaim under different names, in different languages, were not confined to a single city or a single valley. They held territory across a wide arc of the ancient Levant. From the highlands of southern Canaan, where the Anakim controlled the mountain fortresses, to the eastern plateau of Moab, where the Emim had established their own presence, to territories further north that would surface in later chapters of the same territorial narrative. They were distributed across the landscape, and they were old. This is what the Deuteronomy passage quietly conveys. These groups are described in the past tense, the people who used to live there. Former inhabitants. Communities with deep roots in specific landscapes they had, in a very real geographical sense, shaped by the weight of their long presence. The fortresses. The high places. The ancient cities whose names preserve the memory of specific individuals from these lineages, all of it pointing toward a historical reality the ancient world accepted as foundational to its understanding of the land. Before the current order of nations, before the territorial assignments and covenant boundaries that Moses was explaining to a generation born in the desert, there was another order. And that order had left its fingerprints on every significant piece of high ground from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean coast. The Rephaim were the geologic memory of the ancient Levant. Their names had been carved into the mountains long before anyone alive in Moses' time had drawn their first breath. And now a nation of former slaves, people who had spent 400 years in a foreign land. People with no inherited memory of these hills and valleys, no ancestral relationship with these specific stones and shadows, were being asked to walk directly into that memory. This is not the story of one fortress. It never was. It is the story of an entire landscape that remembered something. There is a sentence in the book of Numbers that has been quoted, analyzed, theologized, and debated for 3,000 years. Almost no one reads it correctly. When the 12 scouts returned from their survey of the land and deliver their report to Moses and the assembled community, 10 of them, 10 out of 12, say the following: "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The standard interpretation of this sentence treats it as a failure of faith. A moment of weakness. A psychological collapse in the face of a challenge that a sufficiently courageous or believing person would have been able to withstand. But look more carefully at what the text actually says. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. The scouts do not say, "We were grasshoppers." They say, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes." This is not a description of objective physical reality. This is the scouts reporting their own psychological state with, and this is remarkable, a degree of self-awareness that the passage rarely receives credit for. They knew what was happening to them. They could observe themselves being diminished in real time. They could feel the architecture of their own confidence collapsing, triggered by nothing more than scale, by size, by the visual and spatial relationship between their own bodies and the walls and inhabitants of Kiriath-Arba. And then the second half of the sentence. And we looked the same to them. This is speculative, obviously. The scouts cannot have held a direct conversation with the sons of Anak about how the sons of Anak perceived them. What the scouts are reporting here is something more primal and more troubling than a diplomatic exchange. They are reporting a feeling of being seen. Not just of being small, but of being recognized as small. Of existing within a visual field that categorized them instantly, effortlessly, without malice, without even particular interest, simply by the mathematics of scale. There is something in the human nervous system that responds to radical, scaled differences before conscious thought intervenes. Before language, before analysis, Before any strategic calculation, the body makes its assessment. And the body's assessment of radical physical disparity is not nuanced. It registers as threat. Not threat in the narrow sense of imminent physical attack. Threat in the deeper, older, more fundamental sense, the kind that activates the part of the brain that has been running survival calculations since the first humans stood upright and scanned an uncertain horizon. This is the weapon of the Anakim. Not swords. Not siege engines. Not superior numbers. Scale. Pure, passive, architecturally reinforced scale. The ancient texts do not describe the sons of Anak pursuing the Israelite scouts. They do not describe an ambush, a display of military aggression, or even a verbal exchange. What they describe is presence. The quiet, overwhelming, entirely passive presence of people living at their natural size within a city built to accommodate them, and the catastrophic psychological effect that presence had on observers who encountered it unprepared. Consider the geometry of the approach to Kiriath-Arba. The city is not on flat ground. The scouts must climb to reach it. As they climb, the walls above them grow. The angle increases. The city does not come closer in the way that a city on a plane comes closer, with gradual revelation, with growing detail that allows the eyes to adjust and the mind to process. Kiriath-Arba arrives all at once. You crest a ridge, and it is simply there above you, filling the upper third of your visual field. The limestone blocks massive in a way that is difficult to reconcile with anything the Bronze Age landscape has previously shown you. And then the lintels. Door frames and gate arches cut from single blocks of stone built to proportions that accommodate a different scale of inhabitant than the one standing in the valley below looking up. Architecture is argument. Architecture is statement. Architecture is the most durable form of psychological communication the ancient world possessed. Before a single word is spoken, before a single figure appears on the walls, before any military threat is made or implied, the city has already told you everything you need to know about the relationship between the people inside it and the people outside it. You are not the intended scale of visitor here. This is what the scouts experienced. Not a fantastical encounter with supernatural beings. Not the kind of event that requires mythological categories to explain. Something simpler and, in many ways, more devastating. They walked up to something built for someone else. And they felt it. There is a concept in architecture, ancient and modern, that sometimes goes by the name of the psychology of approach. The way that a built environment communicates your place within it before you have taken a single step inside. The angle of the entrance. The height of the ceiling. The scale of the objects used for ordinary functions. All of it telling you, in a language the body understands before the mind catches up. This was not made with you in mind. Every institution that has ever sought to exercise durable power over a population has understood this principle instinctively. You build high. You build massive. You design the approach so that the ordinary human being must tilt their head back to find the top of what you have made. The courts of ancient Egypt. The cathedrals of medieval Europe. The government buildings of modern capitals whose columns and pediments and sweeping stone staircases were never intended to make the petitioner comfortable. They were intended to make the petitioner feel small. Scale produces smallness in the observer. Without exception. Without regard to the observer's faith, courage, intelligence, or intention. The Anakim did not invent this principle, but the textual record suggests they embodied it more completely, more naturally, more inescapably than any political architecture built by human hands alone. Because they did not need to engineer the intimidation. They were the intimidation. When Hyman and Shishai and Talmai looked down from the walls of Kiriath-Arba at 12 men standing in the valley below, 12 men who had survived the Sinai, who had endured a generation of the wilderness, who carried within them the memory of a covenant with the God who had split the Red Sea, those 12 men did not feel like the inheritors of a divine promise. They felt like grasshoppers. And 10 of them went home and said so. Here's the question the texts quietly pose and never answer. Was that a failure of faith? Or was it an honest report? There is a serious case to be made, a case the texts themselves do not foreclose, that the 10 scouts were not faithless men. They were accurate observers delivering an accurate assessment of an accurate situation. The sons of Anak were real. The walls were genuinely overwhelming. The psychological effect was real, documented, and reported with striking precision. What the scouts lacked and what Joshua and Caleb, the 2 dissenters, insisted they possessed was not better information. It was not a different set of facts about the dimensions of the walls or the height of the inhabitants. It was a framework large enough to hold both realities simultaneously. Yes. The walls are high. Yes. The sons of Anak are real. Yes. We are smaller than everything in that valley. And we are going in anyway. That gap between accurate perception of an overwhelming obstacle and the paralysis that follows is not a story about ancient Canaan. That is the geography every human being navigates every time they stand at the base of something that was not built with them in mind. Every time they look up at a wall, literal or institutional or personal, and feel the ancient, pre-linguistic calculation begin to run. The body says, "You are a grasshopper here." And the only question that has ever mattered is what you decide to do with that information. The Anakim did not need to lift a single weapon. They needed only to exist. And existence at that scale, in that city, behind those walls, was enough to turn an entire nation around. And so the scouts came back. And the people wept. The report was delivered. The walls were described. The names were spoken aloud: Hyman, Shishai, Talmai, the sons of the line of Arba, and an entire generation of people, standing at the border of everything they had been promised, sat down in the dust and wept. And then they turned around. 40 more years of the wilderness. 40 more years of the same desert that had already claimed so much of them. Chosen, if chosen is the right word, over one afternoon beneath the walls of Kiriath-Arba. The texts record this as a tragedy, as failure, as the moment a covenant community chose the familiar weight of the wilderness over the terrifying possibility of the promised land. But stand in the desert for a moment and consider it from the other direction. They had seen something true. Something that the ancient world, including the careful, anxious scribes who copied the Book of Giants in those limestone caves above the Dead Sea, took seriously enough to record and preserve and puzzle over across generations. Something that the modern instinct to rationalize and categorize and reduce tends to flatten into either mythology or metaphor. The Anakim were in Hebron. Documented. Named. Located. Alive. Their city was older than Egypt's great delta capitals. Their lineage ran backward into the theological question that the Qumran scribes could not resolve, the unanswered problem embedded in the center of the ancient world's sacred cosmology. If the flood was the final word, what were these men? No answer was ever cleanly given. What was given instead was a border. On one side of that border, a people who had spent 40 years learning, slowly and at great cost, that the wilderness could not kill them. Who had crossed the sea on dry ground and eaten bread that appeared each morning from nowhere and carried within their collective memory the weight of an impossible promise. On the other side, the sons of Arba, looking down from their limestone heights with a cold, absolute calm of men who had never had a reason to be afraid of anything that walked up from the valley below. The scouts who had walked deep enough into the land to bring back grapes from the valley of Eshcol, grapes so large, the text tells us, that 2 men were required to carry a single cluster. Those scouts had seen the harvest, and they had seen what stood between them and it. 3 names on a fortress wall. 3 men in a city older than the pharaohs. 3 sons of Anak behind walls that had never been broken. And so we arrive at the place where the history ends and the question begins. Because the texts are silent on the interior life of Kiriath-Arba. We have no account from Ahiman, from Shishai, from Talmai. No record of what they saw when they looked out from their walls at the horizon to the south. Whether they received reports of the approaching nation. Whether they felt anything at all at the news of a people gathering at the border of the land. What we have is the testimony of those who stood at the bottom and what they saw when they looked up. So tell me in the comments honestly, when the scouts of Israel saw the Anakim, were they looking at an undefeated remnant of a forbidden cosmic age, or were they simply projecting their own deep psychological fears onto a tall, formidable desert kingdom? Let me know where you land below. To witness the moment the scouts step into the valley of cluster grapes and feel the ground tremble beneath the boots of the 3 sons of Anak, subscribe. The war for the land is about to break.
Enter the realm of divine secrets. Welcome to Bible Confidential.